Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only the sky. Imagine all the people living for imagine there's no country. Isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but you know I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will is one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people living for today. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but you know I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world is one.
After the Persian Gulf War. So I bought it, I sent it away for it. It came to me in the mail. I got up, I sat at my family room table, and I opened it up, and I read the whole book in one reading. I'm a really slow reader. I have a lot of great books I've never finished, you know, in my case, all the great books, or many of them. But I read Joel's book the first time all the way through, and I go, oh my God, my antennas went up. I've got to get copies of this book and get it out to people. And but I couldn't find him. It said he was living in Chicago, and I couldn't find him. And then this friend of mine, who's a private detective, ran his name and said he's actually living in Los Angeles, and he's going or working at UCLA. And he gave me a phone number, so I called it up. And I said, are you the guy that wrote this book? And he said he was. I said, whoa. And so I made a date, went over to his house. He only lived a few miles away from me, right off of Los Angeles there. And I showed him my film, we talked. He said, well, the book was out of print, and there were only 7,000 copies of it, the original one printed. And I just said, I've never done it before, but I'd like to bring your book back. It's just, this is the best way to teach people, I can see. I used to distribute a smaller book called The CIA's Greatest Hits, and you could buy those for inexpensive, and it's a good book. But Joel's is much more than that one. So he agreed to let me try and do it. He was going to write a little update, and he wasn't necessarily even updated. He was going to just write a little update in the forward. And then Bush got elected and 9/11 happened, and Joel agreed to rewrite the book. And we did that in 2002, and we got AK Press to join in with us because Joel wanted to have a real publisher, and they are real publishers. They publish hundreds of books. So we did it. I did it with them. And we printed 20,000 that year, right before the LA Times Festival of Books that was held at UCLA all those years ago. It's now at SC now. And I got the book just in time. I think Sasha was there with me while we was out in the boonies that first year. But what a great place to be, and so many people come to that. And it's going to be happening again in April. And I was just counting on my fingers last night. This will be my 14th year in a row at the LA Times Festival of Books. It's now at USC with The Dickens to War. I don't know if any other single book has been there that long, but it sells and people buy it. And now this year I'm going to have the new updated version. So I'm just so happy you're all here tonight. I'm so happy that Joel's here because I don't get a chance to say to Joel, everybody said it, but thank you, Joel. He's not just this brilliant guy who wrote and drew the book. He's a very kind man. He's a really loving guy. He is. He's got a beautiful wife, A, and your little daughter, Marley. And I'm so happy and proud and thrilled to be able to get his book out there, you know. So, and all the people in the room here tonight who helped me, there's so many of you who over the years to get the book out. Robert and Lupe, the last 2 years, have taken it to Fort Benning and giving it away. I haven't gone the last couple of years. And Sandra and Euless have helped with the book so much. And of course, Julie, where's Julie Webster?
Here.
Julie's right here. She's helped me table forever. And so many others I'm probably forgetting. But it's fun tabling with this book. Because the other thing, it's very inexpensive. And so people can afford to get it. So I wanted to say with the new updated version, we have 5 new endorsements. We have an endorsement from Colonel Ann Wright, who is going to Cuba in a couple of weeks with Cold Pink. And by the way, someone in this room is going. Kathleen Wang is going with them right here in the front row.
Ann's going, so is David Swanson and Medea Benjamin.
Whoa.
And I'm going to ask them to sign it before I give it away.
And Kathleen's going, and David Swanson is another new endorser. And Medea Benjamin is giving us a new endorsement. And Cynthia McKinney, former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. And the other one we got, a new endorsement, is from Glenn Greenwald. So, but just, if you haven't taken a look at some of the people who already endorsed the book, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Susan Sarandon, Ron Kovic, Martin Sheen, Ed Asner, Chris Christopherson, Ramsey Clark, Reverend James Lawson, Blaise Pompey, Fernando Suarez. I could go on and on here. Helen Keldicott, Kathy Kelly, who Blaise mentioned earlier, who endorses the book, William Bloom, and so many others. It's really an honor to have all these people endorse Joel's book, our book, and help me welcome Joel tonight. Give him, he doesn't get this very often, so he's so shy. Oops, sorry. Joel, come on up here and say hello, everybody.
So first, I'd really like to thank Frank for putting out this new edition of Addicted to War, for organizing this event, and for all the work he's done against U.S. militarism for all these years. And it really is our book. I wrote the book, but the book wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for Frank, and Frank getting it out all around the world.
Hey, Frank.
Yeah, Frank. That's right.
It's really full of people who have helped.
No, it doesn't make any difference to write a book if it's not going to get, nobody's going to read it. And the first edition that I put out in 1991, they sold 7,000 copies, the publisher did, and that's nothing compared with Frank's hundreds of thousands of copies. So it makes all the difference if you're really getting the book out. I'd also like to thank Mike and Blaise and Fernando and all the other folks who've been working against U.S. militarism for so many years, and making such a commitment to doing this. And really to everybody in this room. I was going to thank everybody for coming tonight, but really everybody here is an activist against wars, and for everything that you've done all these years. There's nobody in here that I don't think has probably been involved in this for many years and working against U.S. militarism for many years. It's been 10 years since the last edition of Addicted to War. That's a long time. Frank's been bugging me all this time to put out a new, updated edition. Finally, I've had time to do it. It's out now. But a lot has happened in those last 10 years. If you remember back in 2004 when the last edition of this book came out, the U.S. has been involved had invaded Iraq the year before, had been involved in Iraq for a war, making a war in Iraq. 3 years before that, it invaded Afghanistan. Now, when the US invaded Afghanistan, it thought that it was going to quickly depose the Taliban regime, get rid of Al-Qaeda, crush Al-Qaeda, and then set up a US client regime in Afghanistan, and everything would be quiet and settled there, and they would control Afghanistan. And then they thought they were very confident when they invaded Iraq. They thought they could make quick work of the Saddam Hussein regime and set up another US client regime in Iraq, in the center of the Middle East, in the center of the oil fields. And it didn't turn out that way. It was already clear in 2004 it wasn't turning out that way. It's much more clear now. They really still haven't learned the lesson of Vietnam. This is no longer the colonial era. You can't just go and invade a country and set up a new government, a new client state, and expect it to stand. You could in the past. The U.S. did that many, many times in the past and set up client regimes and was successful in doing that. But you can't do it anymore. People won't stand for it. People won't accept it. And that's the lessons of the last few wars that the U.S. has been in. They haven't learned those lessons. But 13 years later, it's really clear. The U.S. has been waging war steadily for 13 years. They have failed. They failed to set up stable U.S. client regimes in either Afghanistan or Iraq. These regimes are unstable, they're corrupt, many of these regimes the U.S. has set up in the past are corrupt too, but these are not standing. There's civil wars in both countries. The countries are both a mess, they're devastated, and they're in chaos. Al-Qaeda has hardly been vanquished. In 2003, it was a relatively small organization in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now it's across the Middle East and North Africa, stronger than ever before in many ways. Much more decentralized, but it's a lot more people involved in it. ISIS didn't exist in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq. And now ISIS controls half of Iraq and half of Syria, and has got converts and followers all across North Africa and the Middle East. These wars have been disasters. And everybody should think about this when Obama tells us that they're going to get rid of ISIS by bombing Syria and Iraq. They created ISIS by bombing Iraq, by invading Iraq. That's where ISIS came from. They're strengthening ISIS, actually, by bombing Syria and Iraq and by basically creating the folks that are following ISIS by attacking these countries. But I think to really understand what's going on in these countries, you have to go back. You have to look at the whole history of U.S. foreign wars. Going back a couple hundred years, more than a couple hundred years, to actually the birth of this country. It's always been a very aggressive country. The U.S. Revolution was about getting rid of the British colonial overseers so that the colonists could attack and take more Indian territory. The British were controlling them and not allowing them to do that. And that's what they did for the next 100 years or so. They took over the rest of the continent, over the west coast, and waged wars pretty steadily over all those years. Waging wars in the Caribbean, going as far as the Philippines and across the Pacific, capturing colonies, getting into this colonial game. But the U.S. addiction to war, then it began early, but it really changed qualitatively in the Second World War. And then the U.S. built up this military machine in a far grander extent than ever before. And the amazing thing is that after the war, before that, the U.S. had mobilized for war and then demobilized. It had basically shut down the weapons factories after the war and sent the soldiers home and waited to the next war and then built up for the next war. After the Second World War, the U.S. became the main hegemon in the world, and it decided it was going to keep this army. It was going to keep this huge, massive force that it built up in the Second World War. It was not going to demobilize. Instead, it was going to go set up bases that the U.S. had not had before across the world and build up a Navy and an Air Force that was going to span the globe, and it was going to maintain this steadily, not demobilize, keep this war machine going. This was unprecedented for the United States. And that's what it's done since then. It's cost hundreds of billions of dollars a year to keep these weapon plants in operation and to keep the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the field and all these bases around the world. to feed this war machine. And then it's had to make wars in order to keep this war machine going as well. In Korea and Vietnam, and then the wars and steady stream of wars. Big wars were the first Iraq War and then the second Iraq War. And after 9/11, the U.S. has steadily been in war since then, for the last 13 years. This is now the longest wars in U.S. history, and they're still making wars. These wars are not over. It's now a steady stream of wars. It's been steady war for 13 years now. It used to be that wars began and the wars ended. It's looking like now, and especially with Iraq and Afghanistan going on, but also with these drone wars that they're starting now, there's not going to be any beginning and end of wars anymore. This is an endless war. They're putting drones in the sky above Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia. They're keeping drones in the sky there, attacking constantly. They have no plans to end this. There won't be a beginning of this war or an end of this war. This is an endless war now. And this is part of the development now of the U.S. addiction to war. It's getting worse, it's getting more intense, it's getting more expensive, it's getting more harmful, it's causing more damage, and this is where we've been going for the last, since the birth of this country, but really since the Second World War, and it's evolved now into an endless war. The cost of these wars have been tremendous. If you just look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's cost $4.3 trillion. People have estimated that these are the costs until now. This is until a year or so ago. They've estimated if you stretch it out into the future, the cost of these wars, the cost of veterans benefits, the cost of medical benefits for all these veterans that have been hurt, the cost of the interest on the debt, that it could be another $7.9 billion or $1 trillion in the future. And of course, this is, all of us are going to pay for this. This is financial costs. Everybody knows there's been thousands of American soldiers that have been killed and hundreds of thousands injured, both physically injured, tremendous ugly injuries, but also psychological injuries. That's the cost to the Americans. The costs overseas are even greater, of course. There's been hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's devastated both countries, and the wars are far from over. Now, most people don't want these wars. I think it's very clear. In the United States, overseas, most people don't want these wars. How do they justify these wars? It's a constant effort to justify these wars. And it's become very clear to me, especially in just this recent time, that in order to justify these wars, in order to justify the wars in the past, the U.S. needed the Soviet Union. Now it needs Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These are enemies of the Pentagon. The Pentagon and ISIS are mutual enemies, but in some ways they're allies. They need each other. They depend on each other. If the Pentagon wasn't bombing Iraq and Syria, ISIS wouldn't exist. It couldn't recruit people, it wouldn't have mass support, it couldn't exist. If the United States was not devastating villages and killing civilians, it wouldn't exist. And if ISIS wasn't cutting off people's heads, the Pentagon would have a hard time justifying continuing these wars and continuing bombing people and mobilizing people in this country to support these wars. So they're mutually dependent on each other. They need this for their huge military budgets and for sending troops, continuing to send troops, continuing to send planes, continuing to send ships overseas to wage war into the Middle East. So these are warmongers on both sides. You can see that both of them, their entire enterprise depends on having an enemy like that to fight. You know, you even look at 9/11 that way. In some ways, Al-Qaeda depended on the U.S. response to 9/11. And the U.S. has depended on Al-Qaeda's response since then, and they need this kind of, in order for both of them to wage war, because their whole existence in some ways depends on having these wars to wage. This addiction is getting worse, it's getting more intense, it's getting more dangerous, it's causing more devastation around the world. And it's becoming more and more clear that the U.S. can't afford this addiction. The U.S. is not in the same position in the world that it was 30, 40 years ago. when the U.S. really was, dominated the world in a way that no other power had. The U.S. is in decline. The U.S.'s position in the world is in decline. Nevertheless, it wants to maintain this military hegemony. In a way, in some ways, its military is more powerful than other militaries. Its military and hegemony of the world is stronger than ever before. Its economic position is not. And this is extremely costly for the United States. It's not sustainable. It won't be sustainable. This is a huge contradiction, and it will continue to be a contradiction. It will get to be much more of a contradiction in the future. And that's the situation that we're in. That's the situation we're looking forward to in the future. And more people in this country are going to start to question it and get tired of it. People are already tired of it. Of course, everybody in the room is tired of it, but it's not only us. I think that most people in the United States don't want war. They got very sick of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's very clear right now. They don't want to pay for it. They don't want their children to have to go to war and fight and die. They've seen enough of all that. And it's not only folks on the left. I think also awful lot of the folks, the Tea Party folks on the right, the libertarians, the anti-tax people, they don't want to pay taxes for these wars anymore. Actually, I've been invited on Blaze radio show and on others here at KPFK and other left-wing radio shows around the country to talk about this, but I've also been invited on libertarian radio shows, call-in shows, where all the folks call in. They say, I don't agree with you about schools. We shouldn't be spending so much money about schools, if you recognize the first page of the book. But they completely agree with me about wars. And they shouldn't be paying for the Pentagon. They shouldn't be waging all these wars overseas. Now, this is not an alliance that doesn't exist. These folks on the libertarians and the Tea Party folks who don't want to pay taxes, at this point, an awful lot of them are voting for the Republican Party. But I think there's a basis for politics to change radically in this country. It's not there now. They're pretty far from it now. But this is unsustainable. This addiction to war is unsustainable. The whole way this country is organized right now, when so many resources go to the Pentagon and go to maintaining these bases overseas and waging these wars overseas continuously, that I think politics can change radically. 20, 30 years from now, we may see a whole different way that politics is organized in this country. And that's up to us. I think we can really make some change if we want to. There's a lot of folks that are confused but discontented. And it's up to us to help turn these discontented people, even these confused people, turn them into anti-war people. And I think we can. And that's what Addicted to War, the book, is about. That's what all of your work is about. And I wish you all the best and continue.
All right.